So today on November 1st, we celebrate the great Solemnity of All Saints, remembering all those saints throughout the Church's history, both known and unknown, those saints who inspire within us a yearning to be like them and to be with them, the friends of God who are in the family of God, the eternal communion of the saints in heaven. And in November as well, in our country, we celebrate and remember in a special way our veterans, remembering especially Veterans Day, which we celebrate this month. And the saints and our veterans really intersect in a particularly special way in Father Vincent Capodanno. Father Vincent Capodanno is a native New Yorker. He was born to an Italian immigrant family, one of 10 children. Lived a pretty humble life as a kid growing up in Staten Island. When he was about 10 years old, actually on his 10th birthday, his father tragically passed away from an accident at work, and the family was left fatherless. He was always a humble, good, simple kid, went through school without really too much of a problem, went to college, and it was in college he really started discerning a call to the priesthood, and not just to like the diocesan priesthood, to be a parish priest in his own area, but to be a missionary. He was discerning a vocation with the Maryknoll Fathers, and the Maryknoll Fathers send their priests all around the world, so very different and exotic places, more so in the past than today. And Father Vincent Capodanno felt within him a call to be a great missionary priest, to preach the gospel to the far corners of the world. He discerned that call. His mother was very upset with that. She wanted him, understandably, to be around. Eventually, through many tears and prayers and many long talks, she kind of gave her permission, her seal of approval for him to go for it. He went through the seminary. He was a good guy all the way throughout the seminary. A little bit of a smart aleck, too. He would sometimes get in trouble for smoking cigarettes out back in the seminary. Wasn't as big of a deal then now as it is then, or vice versa. So he had a little bit of a wild streak to him, a little bit of an attitude thing. But he was a great guy. He was loved by his comrades. He was ordained a priest, and he was sent to Asia to be a missionary in Asia. He struggled learning the language. He threw himself into the life of the people. Sadly, when he was away in Asia, his mother back home passed away, and he couldn't get back home to see her before she passed or even for the funeral. But no doubt he was close to her in prayer and remembered her most especially through the celebration of Holy Mass. And it was during this time when he was a missionary in Asia that the Vietnam War was going on. And he saw on a few occasions the American soldiers going through Asia, both right before and after their time in Vietnam, in country, in combat. And he saw how so many of these brave men and women, mostly guys at that time in the military, these young guys, really not that much older than you, away from home for the first time ever, really seeing and living through hell on earth, and how they really didn't have a priest. There wasn't really enough priests, enough pastoral support for these guys, and even just some good, healthy support overall. And he felt very moved to be their priest, so much so that he started a kind of campaign with his superiors that they would allow him to become a Navy chaplain so as to serve the troops. And it was a pretty good back and forth between his superiors and himself, pushing for him to become a Navy chaplain, and eventually his superiors kind of relinquished, and they said, okay, you could go for it. And he did, and he went through his basic officer school, he went through his chaplain school, and he was sent to minister to the Marines in Vietnam. And while he was there as an officer and as a chaplain, as a Catholic priest, first and foremost, he distinguished himself for kind of throwing off any of those glamorous things that come along with being an officer, having nicer quarters, nicer meals, not having to do so much of the grunt work. He threw all that off. He really became somebody who was with his guys in the worst of the worst. He was with his enlisted men. He was in the same tough conditions that they were in. He would go out with them when he didn't have to. And he lovingly became known as the Grunt Padre for that. And on many occasions, he went out when they were actually engaged in combat. He would go to the fiercest places of fighting. And he would go there so he could minister to the wounded and to the dying, both spiritually through the sacraments, and also even just basic first aid kind of stuff. And he really went over and above what he had to do. and his men loved him for it. He had like a kind of celebrity status among his Marines. They loved him. And eventually on September 4th, 1967, Operation Swift was launched, and the men of Father Capodanno's unit were caught in basically like an ambush. They were outnumbered, and they were severely outgunned. And they heard the calls coming in for backup and reinforcements, and Father Capodanno was told to stay back home, basically, where it was safe, but he disregarded that. He jumped on a helicopter at the last minute and went to the front lines of the fighting. And when he got there, he did his thing. He got off, he would minister to the wounded and to the dying. He would run through pretty dangerous fire to get to where people were in need of a priest. One of his kind of throwaway lines that he would say all the time to the wounded and the sick were, God is with us today. Keep calm. God is with us today. God is with us today. And he did this, and during that time on September 4th, he at one point had an explosion go off near him. The explosion was so severe, it almost cut off his entire right arm. It was barely kind of hanging on. And he was told to go and evacuate, but he refused, instead giving his spot to evacuate to those who were worse off than he. And he demanded to stay right there where the fighting was fiercest. They said that even during that time, he would use his left arm to raise up his right arm so he can give absolution and celebrate the sacraments with those who were wounded and dying. Eventually, he saw a medic, a corpsman, not too far off in a kind of open field. And he went to go run to him to minister to this wounded and dying medic. And while he did that, he was shot in the back 27 times and killed instantly. He was deeply mourned and grieved for by the men he was with. They missed him terribly. And as he was buried back in his native Staten Island, it was definitely a hero's homecoming for him. Father Capodanno actually received the Medal of Honor, the Congressional Medal of Honor, the highest award in our nation given to the military. And interestingly, since the Civil War, the only chaplains to have received the Medal of Honor are Catholic priests. Out of all the chaplains in the military, only Catholic priests since the Civil War have received the Medal of Honor. And Father Capodanno received the Medal of Honor, and then he was also, his cause for canonization, that is the official process in the Catholic Church by which somebody is recognized as saint, was opened. And he's in the works of going through the Vatican process of being formally recognized as a saint. He's officially a servant of God, kind of the first step in becoming a canonized saint. But I think a few things, when we look at the life of Father Capodanno, we see what the Navy holds up as its quote-unquote core values, honor, courage, and commitment. We see that they find their fullest expression in the words of Jesus when he said, "Greater love hath no man than to lay down his life for his friends." When we see Father Capodanno, he received the crown of martyrdom of charity, by ministering to those who were wounded and dying, those who were in really the worst situation possible. We see this man whose virtues we ought to emulate, and we ought to want to make our own as well. Like St. Bernard of Clairvaux said in talking about the Solemnity of All Saints, in which we celebrate today, the saints inspire within us a yearning to be like them and to be with them, to be who we want to see. Those are the saints that we ought to emulate, not pop stars or athletes or anybody else. The saints, they show us to be who we want to see. We want to be seen as saints. We ought to want to be seen as saints. We want to be like them and with them forever in the family of God. Father Capodanno especially also shows us the grace of seeing the chaos of the moment from an eternal perspective. To see the chaos of the moment from an eternal perspective. This man loved with Christ-like charity while bullets were whizzing over his head. And he saw young men all around him in the worst possible situations. And through that, he brought the presence of God with him. If only we could do the same when our world has its own kind of bullets whizzing over our head constantly through all the social media things, all the news updates, all the negative stuff going on. As difficult as it is to be a person of faith today in our secular environment, there's so much chaos all around us. Father Capodanno and the saints who are in his company, they show us the grace to see the chaos of our time from an eternal perspective. to not get so sucked in to the chaos all around us, but to see it from God's perspective, an eternal perspective. So we pray for that grace today at this Holy Eucharist, to hold back nothing of ourselves, like the saints from the same Jesus who gives himself totally to us today, body, blood, soul, and divinity, and that by the grace of God, one day we too may join their company.